Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. A normal street looks the same everywhere. Neat lawns, mailboxes standing like sentinels, the quiet hum of a lawnmower on a Saturday afternoon. On Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, this suburban tableau was a carefully maintained illusion, a stage set for a life of mundane normalcy. But behind one particular fence, in a squalid collection of sheds and tents, an entire universe had been constructed. It was a universe with a population of 1, then 2, then 3, and finally 4, a universe ruled by a deluded god of its own making, a man who believed he was channeling the divine. For 18 years, this secret world, this backyard universe, existed just feet away from unsuspecting neighbors. It was a place where time had stopped, where a childhood was stolen, and where an identity was erased and rewritten. It held a secret so profound, so horrifying, that its eventual revelation would shock the world and force us to confront the terrifying reality that the greatest monsters are often the ones living right next door, hidden in plain sight. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of long-term captivity. We are not just examining a kidnapping. We are exploring the insidious mechanics of psychological manipulation, the systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate unchecked for decades, and the almost unimaginable resilience of a human spirit, systematically broken and then painstakingly pieced back together. We will explore how Phillip and Nancy Garrido were able to hold J.C. Dugard captive for nearly 2 decades, creating a twisted family unit built on a foundation of terror and lies. This is the story of a life stolen, and the incredible, arduous journey of taking it back. The story begins on a bright Monday morning, June 10, 1991, in a small community nestled near the crystalline waters of South Lake Tahoe. 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard was a typical kid. She had blonde hair, a bright smile, and a love for animals, especially her cats. She was living with her mother, Terry Probin, her younger sister, Shayna, and her stepfather, Carl Probin. It was a blended family, finding its rhythm. That morning, J.C. was dressed in a pink windbreaker and pink stretch pants, an outfit chosen with the care and deliberation of a young girl on the cusp of adolescence. She was walking the few blocks from her home to the school bus stop, a route she had taken countless times before. It was a walk that should have taken minutes. Her stepfather, Carl, was in the garage. He saw a gray sedan, a Ford or a Mercury, make a U-turn and pull up beside J.C. He saw a man get out, and then he heard a scream. At first, his mind didn't process the horror. He thought perhaps it was a domestic dispute, a father grabbing his child. But the car sped away, and J.C. was gone. Carl jumped on his mountain bike, frantically pedaling after the vehicle, trying to get a license plate, trying to keep them in sight. But the car was too fast. It disappeared down the road, taking J.C. with it. In those frantic, breathless moments, J.C. Dugard vanished from the world she knew. The initial investigation was a maelstrom of activity. The FBI was called in immediately, a standard procedure for non-family abductions. Law enforcement descended on the quiet neighborhood, canvassing for witnesses, searching for the gray sedan. Carl Probin, the only eyewitness, was instrumental. He described the driver as a white male, about 6 feet tall, with long, dark, stringy hair. He also described a female accomplice in the car. But his most crucial contribution was what he saw happen inside the car just before it sped away. He saw the man use what looked like a stun gun on J.C. The taser-like device became a key piece of early evidence. a specific and unusual detail in a crime that was otherwise a parent's worst nightmare, cloaked in ambiguity. Based on Carl's description, a composite sketch of the male suspect was created and blasted across newspapers and television screens. The community rallied, holding vigils, plastering missing posters with JC's smiling face on every telephone pole and storefront window. Her mother, Terry, made gut-wrenching appeals to the public, her face a mask of anguish as she pleaded for her daughter's safe return. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The gray sedan was never found. The leads dried up. The case grew cold, relegated to a file box in a cold case unit, a persistent, gnawing ache in the hearts of her family and the community that had searched for her. For 18 years the world outside moved on, but for J.C. Dugard, time had been frozen, trapped within the confines of that disappearing car. To understand how such a crime was possible, how a young girl could be held for nearly 2 decades without anyone knowing, we must first dissect the minds of her captors. Phillip Garrido and his wife, Nancy. Their story is not a simple tale of a monstrous man and his passive wife. It is a far more complex and disturbing study in codependency, delusion, and shared psychosis. They were a symbiotic pair, each feeding the other's pathology, creating a closed loop of dysfunction that enabled unimaginable cruelty. Philip Craig Garrido was a man steeped in a history of sexual violence and bizarre, grandiose delusions. He was born in 1951, and his early life was marked by instability and substance abuse. By his 20s, he was already on a dark path. In 1976, he kidnapped a 25-year-old woman in South Lake Tahoe, the very same area where he would later abduct J.C. Dugard. He forced her at knife point into a van, drove her to a storage unit in Reno, Nevada, and brutally raped her for hours. He was eventually caught, convicted of first-degree kidnapping and rape, and sentenced to 50 years to life in federal prison. It was in Leavenworth, a maximum security penitentiary, that the seeds of his future crimes began to germinate in the fertile soil of his warped mind. In prison, Garrido didn't just serve time. He underwent a transformation. He became a model prisoner, renouncing drugs, finding religion, and even learning to play the guitar. He appeared to be a man reformed. But beneath this veneer of rehabilitation, his psychopathy was mutating. He began to develop a strange and elaborate religious philosophy, which he would later document in rambling, incoherent writings. He believed he had the ability to speak with the tongues of angels, and had been given a divine mission by God. He claimed God had cured him of his sexual deviancy by giving him a special box, a device that could cancel out unwanted sexual thoughts. It was a classic case of a predator cloaking his perversions in the language of piety, a way to grant himself permission to commit the unthinkable. His apparent reform was so convincing that he was granted parole in January 1988 after serving only 11 years of his sentence. He was released into a world that believed he was no longer a threat. It was during his brief period of freedom before his first conviction that he met a young woman named Nancy Bocanegra. Nancy was a teenager when she met the much older Philip. She came from a troubled background, and was, by all accounts, deeply insecure and desperate for affection and stability. Philip, with his charismatic and controlling personality, likely seemed like a powerful figure to her. They married while he was in prison. She stood by him, seemingly convinced of his innocence or perhaps his redemption. When he was released, she was waiting. Nancy was not merely a bystander in what was to come. She was an essential component. Philip was the architect of the horror, but Nancy was the foundation upon which it was built. She was his enabler, his accomplice, and the female presence that would ultimately help him lure and control a child. Her own psychological needs and vulnerabilities became tools in his arsenal. After his release, the Garridos settled in Antioch, a sprawling suburb in Northern California. They moved into a house owned by Philip's elderly mother. To the outside world, they were an odd but harmless couple. Philip started a small printing business, often handing out business cards that read God's desire. He was known around the neighborhood as a bit of a religious eccentric, a man who would preach on street corners and talk incessantly about his unique connection to the divine. He was seen as strange, but not dangerous. No one could see past the fence in his backyard. No one knew that this seemingly harmless crank was a convicted rapist and kidnapper. And no one knew that he was actively hunting for his next victim, this time with his wife by his side. The parole system, designed to monitor and control men exactly like Philip Garrido, was about to fail in the most catastrophic way imaginable. On that June day in 1991, Nancy Garrido was driving the gray sedan. Philip was in the passenger seat. They had been searching, waiting for the right opportunity. When they saw J.C. Dugard walking alone, they knew they had found her. Philip, armed with the stun gun, snatched her. They threw her in the back of the car, covered her with a blanket, and drove away from the life she knew, heading towards the hidden world they had prepared for her in their backyard on Walnut Avenue. For J.C., the world shrank to the size of a backyard. The property on Walnut Avenue became her prison, a carefully constructed labyrinth of sheds, tents, and tarps designed to keep her hidden from view. Philip Garrido, a man with a twisted sense of craftsmanship and control, had transformed his mother's unassuming suburban lot into a secret compound. The main living quarters for J.C. was a soundproofed shed, a small, dark space designed to muffle any cries for help. He had even built a crude outdoor shower and toilet, creating a self-contained camp that was completely invisible from the street and from neighboring yards. This physical isolation was the first layer of her imprisonment. The second and far more insidious layer was psychological. Philip Garrido began a systematic process of breaking down J.C.'s identity and rebuilding it to suit his own narrative. One of the first things he did was change her name. She was no longer J.C. She was Alyssa. This act of renaming is a powerful tool of control, a way of severing a person's connection to their past, their family, their very sense of self. He became the sole author of her reality. He told her the outside world was dangerous, that no one was looking for her, and that he was her protector. He controlled all information, all food, all human contact. He was her sun, her moon, and her stars, a malevolent god in a universe of his own making. This process of indoctrination was relentless. Garrido subjected J.C. to daily sexual assault, a constant reinforcement of his power and her helplessness. He coupled this physical violence with his bizarre religious ideology. He would read her his rambling manifestos, telling her that their situation was part of a divine plan, that she was chosen to help him fulfill his God's desire mission. This fusion of abuse and pseudo-spiritual rhetoric is a hallmark of cult-like brainwashing. It creates a state of profound confusion, where the victim begins to internalize the abuser's twisted logic as a means of survival. The abuser becomes both the source of terror and the only source of perceived safety. Nancy Garrido's role in this was crucial and complex. She was not a fellow prisoner. She was a jailer. She acted as a female warden, enforcing Philip's rules and participating in J.C.'s confinement. In the early days, her presence may have been a source of paradoxical comfort for JC, a female face in a terrifying new world. But Nancy quickly established herself as part of the oppressive regime. She was JC's primary point of contact when Phillip was away, but she offered no solace, no hope of escape. Instead, she reinforced the narrative that this was their life now. The dynamic between Nancy and JC is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Nancy would sometimes act like a mother or an older sister, teaching JC to cook or do chores, but it was all within the context of their shared captivity under Phillip's rule. She was both a victim of Phillip's control and a perpetrator of JC's abuse, a duality that makes her actions both contemptible and pitiably complex. The birth of JC's two daughters in 1994 and 1997 changed the dynamic of the compound irrevocably. These children were born in the backyard, delivered by JC with only Nancy's assistance. They had no birth certificates, no social security numbers. They did not exist in the eyes of the outside world. For Phillip, they were further proof of his divine mission. For JC, they were both a source of profound love and a new terrible chain. Her survival instinct was no longer just for herself. It was for her children. She had to protect them, to raise them, to create some semblance of normalcy for them in the most abnormal circumstances imaginable. She taught them to read and write. She played games with them. She became a mother, fiercely protective, in the heart of her own prison. The girls grew up believing that Phillip was their father and Nancy was their grandmother. They called JC their own mother, their big sister. They were taught that the world outside the fence was dangerous, and that they had to be quiet and hide whenever visitors came to the main house. Their existence deepened JC's entrapment. How could she escape with two young children? Where would they go? The psychological bonds, already complex, were now interwoven with the primal, unbreakable bond of a mother and her children. This complicated her situation far beyond the typical understanding of Stockholm Syndrome. Her actions were not about developing affection for her captor. They were about the strategic and desperate survival of her family. She had to keep Phillip calm, to placate him, to play along with his delusions, because his stability was directly linked to the safety of her daughters. Over the 18 years, there were numerous moments when the secret world on Walnut Avenue could have been discovered. Neighbors complained about the strange encampment in the backyard. Parole officers were required to make regular visits to the Garrido home. These visits represent the most galling failures in the entire case. Phillip Garrido was a registered sex offender on parole for kidnapping and rape. The conditions of his parole should have been intensely strict, yet officer after officer visited the house and saw nothing amiss. Garrido was a master manipulator. He would clean up the yard before a visit, or schedule appointments at his parole office instead of at home. He would use his mother as a shield, presenting a facade of a man caring for his elderly parent. On one occasion, a parole officer did note the presence of a young girl on the property, but accepted Garrido's explanation that she was a niece. No one ever thought to run a fingerprint, to ask the girl her name when she was alone, or to conduct a thorough search of the outbuildings. The parole system, overburdened and underfunded, treated Garrido as a file, a checklist of requirements to be met. They saw a man who passed his drug tests and held down a job. They failed to see the predator hiding in plain sight. They heard his religious ramblings and dismissed them as eccentricity, not as the blaring red flags of a dangerous and delusional mind. Each missed opportunity, each cursory inspection, was another nail in the coffin of JC's freedom, another year stolen from her life. The system designed to protect society from Phillip Garrido instead became an unwitting accomplice in his crime, allowing his backyard universe to flourish undisturbed for 18 long years. After nearly 2 decades of absolute control, the end of J.C. DeGard's captivity came not from a dramatic police raid or a desperate escape, but from the hubris and bizarre delusions of her captor. Phillip Garrido, increasingly consumed by his God's desire mission, decided he needed to take his message to the world. He wanted to hold a special event, a religious gathering, and he chose the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, as his venue. In August of 2009, he went to the campus police department to apply for a permit. With him were 2 young girls, JC's daughters. His behavior immediately raised red flags for the event coordinator and for 2 campus police officers, Allison Jacobs and Lisa Campbell. He was rambling, incoherent, and intensely strange. But what truly disturbed them was his interaction with the 2 girls. They were pale, almost ethereal, and their behavior was odd and submissive. They seemed completely under his spell. Officer Jacobs, in particular, felt a powerful sense of unease. Her intuition, the instinct that all good police officers possess, told her something was profoundly wrong. She ran a background check on Phillip Garrido and discovered his past, the parole, the conviction for kidnapping and rape. The discovery prompted an immediate call to Garrido's parole officer, a man named Ed Santos. Officer Jacobs relayed her concerns, painting a vivid picture of the strange man and the 2 subservient children. This call was the catalyst, the first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would finally bring down Garrido's secret world. Parole Officer Santos, alerted to Garrido's suspicious contact with children, a clear violation of his parole conditions, ordered him to report to the parole office in Concord the very next day, and he was instructed to bring everyone who lived at his residence. On August 26, 2009, Phillip Garrido arrived at the parole office. With him were his wife Nancy, a woman he introduced as Alyssa, and her 2 daughters. The woman he called Alyssa was, of course, J.C. DeGard. She was 29 years old, but her demeanor was that of a much younger, traumatized person. She was passive, detached, and answered questions in a quiet, rehearsed manner, echoing the stories Phillip had coached her to tell. She was his creation, a living doll programmed to protect his secrets. The parole officers, now on high alert, began their questioning. Phillip was separated from the women. His story quickly began to crumble under scrutiny. He was evasive and contradictory. In a separate room, Officer Santos and a female colleague began to speak with Alyssa. At first, she stuck to the script. She insisted Phillip was a good man, that he had changed his life, and that they were a happy family. She was protecting him, but she was also protecting her children, and the only life she had known for 18 years. The psychological walls Garrido had built were thick and strong. The breakthrough came when the parole officers began to ask about the specifics of her childhood, where she was from. The questions were simple, but they were a direct assault on the fictional identity she had been forced to inhabit. The pressure mounted. Finally, the parole officer made a crucial decision. He told her that she would not be leaving with Phillip Garrido that day, that she and her daughters would be taken into protective custody. He assured her she was safe. It was this promise of safety, perhaps the first credible one she had heard in 18 years, that finally created a crack in the facade. Overwhelmed and exhausted, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her, she broke down. In a quiet, hesitant voice, she confessed her true identity. She said her name was J.C. Dugard. She told them she had been kidnapped from South Lake Tahoe when she was 11 years old. In that moment, the ghost of a long-lost child finally returned to the world. It was a revelation so stunning, so unbelievable, that even the seasoned parole officers struggled to process it. The case that had been cold for nearly 2 decades was suddenly, explosively solved. Phillip and Nancy Garrido were immediately arrested. The world they had built, the kingdom of filth and delusion in their backyard, was breached. For J.C. and her daughters, the ordeal of captivity was over, but a new, equally daunting journey was just beginning. The journey back to life, back to a world they barely knew. The door to the prison had been opened, but stepping through it would require a form of courage few of us can ever imagine. The aftermath of J.C. Dugard's discovery sent shockwaves across the country and around the world. The story was a chilling testament to the failures of the justice system and a profound exploration of human resilience. For the Garridos, the end was swift and absolute. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the damning testimony of their long-held captive, their legal options were non-existent. In 2011, to spare J.C. and her daughters the trauma of a trial, Phillip Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and 13 sexual assault charges. He was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of rape. She was sentenced to 36 years to life. They would both die behind bars, their backyard universe reduced to a crime scene and eventually a pile of rubble. But the true story, the one that defines this case, is not about the punishment of the perpetrators. It's about the recovery of the survivors. The process of reintegration for J.C. Dugard and her 2 daughters was a journey of incredible complexity and emotional depth. When J.C. was finally reunited with her mother, Terry, and her sister, Shayna, it was a moment 18 years in the making. But it was not a simple fairy tale reunion. She was no longer the 11-year-old girl they had lost. She was a 29-year-old woman, a mother of 2, who had endured unimaginable trauma. They had to get to know each other all over again, to bridge the chasm of those stolen years. The initial days and weeks were spent in seclusion, protected from the intense media storm that erupted around her case. Therapists specializing in trauma and long-term captivity were brought in to guide the family through this delicate process. The challenges were immense. J.C. had to relearn the basics of a world that had moved on without her. The internet, cell phones, the political and cultural landscape, it was all new and overwhelming. She had been living in a time capsule, and suddenly she was thrust into the 21st century. Even more complex was the situation with her daughters. They were 11 and 15 years old. They had never been to school, never seen a doctor, never had a friend outside of their immediate, twisted family. Their entire reality had been the backyard compound. Phillip Garrido was the only father they had ever known. Nancy was their grandma, and J.C., their own mother, was their big sister. They had to unlearn an entire lifetime of lies. They had to process the horrifying truth about their father and the circumstances of their birth. They had to forge a new relationship with their mother, seeing her not as a sister, but as the woman who had protected them and loved them through an impossible situation. The family began a process known as unification therapy. It was slow, painstaking work. There were simple joys, like seeing the ocean for the first time or choosing their own clothes. J.C. learned to drive a car, a fundamental act of freedom and autonomy that had been denied to her. She embraced her recovery with a strength that astounded everyone around her. She chose not to be defined by what had been done to her, but by what she would do with the life she had reclaimed. A significant part of her healing came from telling her own story, in her own words. In 2011, she published her memoir, A Stolen Life. The book was a raw, unflinching account of her 18 years in captivity. It was her testimony, a way of taking back the narrative that Phillip Garrido had tried to write for her. She detailed the abuse, the fear, and the manipulation, but she also wrote about the love she had for her daughters, and the moments of resilience that kept her spirit from being completely extinguished. The book was a global bestseller, and a powerful act of defiance. Using the proceeds from her book, and a $20 million settlement she received from the state of California for the parole department's catastrophic negligence, she founded the JAYC Foundation. Just Ask Yourself to Care. Her organization is dedicated to supporting families who have dealt with abduction and other traumas, providing resources and a network of care to help them navigate the long and difficult road to recovery. She transformed her personal tragedy into a public mission, ensuring that other victims would have the support that was so absent during her own ordeal. The anatomy of this case is, ultimately, the anatomy of survival. It reveals the terrifying elasticity of the human psyche, its ability to adapt and endure even in the most horrific conditions. JC's survival was not passive. It was an active, moment-to-moment process of protecting herself and, later, her children. She found ways to create a pocket of humanity within an inhuman world. She read books that Garrido brought her. She wrote in journals. She focused on motherhood. These small acts of self-preservation were her resistance. The reintegration of JC and her daughters provides a rare and invaluable insight into the aftermath of long-term trauma. It shows that recovery is not a single event, but a lifelong process. It involves not just healing from the past, but also learning to build a future. It is about reclaiming a voice and identity, and the simple right to choose one's own path. JC's story did not end when she walked out of that parole office. In many ways, it was just beginning. In dissecting the anatomy of long-term captivity, the case of J.C. Dugard stands as a stark and powerful lesson. It reveals how a combination of a predator's cunning manipulation, a codependent's complicity, and a bureaucracy's blindness can create the conditions for an almost perfect crime. Phillip Garrido wasn't a criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. He was a delusional, charismatic psychopath who exploited the weaknesses in the system and in the people around him. He built a prison not just of fences and soundproof walls, but of psychological terror and fabricated love. Nancy Garrido was his essential accomplice, a woman whose own needs and fears made her a willing jailer, illustrating the chilling reality that evil is not always a solitary act. The failure of the parole system is a critical part of this case's anatomy. It serves as a devastating indictment of a system that prioritized paperwork over people, checklists over common sense. For a decade, parole officers stood just yards away from JC and her children, oblivious to their existence. They saw Garrido's eccentricities as harmless quirks, rather than the blaring sirens of a deeply disturbed and dangerous offender. His case demonstrates that a monitoring system is only as effective as the people who administer it. And when intuition and critical thinking are absent, the consequences can be catastrophic. The state of California's $20 million settlement to JC was more than just compensation. It was an admission of a profound and unforgivable failure to protect. But the most important element, the heart of this story's anatomy, is the incredible resilience of the human spirit. J.C. Dugard's story is not ultimately about the monster who stole her life. It is about the woman who took it back. For 18 years, she was subjected to a systematic effort to erase her, to turn her into a non-person named Alyssa, who existed only to serve the needs of her captor. Yet, she endured. The core of who she was, the girl from South Lake Tahoe, was never completely extinguished. She held on through the birth of her daughters, transforming her own fight for survival into a fight to protect them, creating a small bubble of love in a world of hate. Her journey of reintegration, of learning to be in a world that had forgotten her, is perhaps the most extraordinary part of her story. It redefines our understanding of what it means to be a survivor. Survival is not just the act of staying alive, it is the arduous, courageous work of rebuilding a life from the ashes, of finding joy after unimaginable pain, and of using one's own story to help others. J.C. Dugard did not just escape the backyard, she transcended it. Her life today is a testament to that transcendence. Through her foundation, she has given a voice to the voiceless, and offered hope to families caught in the throes of trauma. She has shown that while the scars of such an ordeal may never fully fade, they do not have to define a person's future. The world now knows her not as Alyssa, the captive, but as J.C. Dugard, the survivor, the author, the advocate, and the mother. Phillip Garrido tried to create his own universe with its own rules, a world where he was God. But he failed. He could imprison a body, but he could never truly capture a soul. In the end, the stolen life was found, and in finding it, taught us all a lasting lesson about the enduring power of hope. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.